The day one nation describes as a great realization of an idea, full of triumph, glory, and pride, is the same day that another nation describes as a catastrophe, full of death, terror, and destruction. On May 15, 1948, the Zionist Party in Tel Aviv, Israel, declared independence as the new state of Israel, a turning point which the Zionist Party commemorates in glory, while Palestinians remember in horror as the Nakba, or catastrophe. Israel's declaration of independence and the war that followed directly impacted both Israelis and Palestinians' political, social, and intellectual circumstances. After the creation of the Israeli state, resentment and conflict between both sides became a major archetype that regrettably never ceased. The event was the turning point that led directly to the perilous situation we see currently in Palestine. The Holy Land has been contested for centuries, and the many generations of Palestinian people living there have been controlled by many different empires throughout the years. At the end of World War I, Palestine, previously under Ottoman rule, was placed under the British mandate. Based on the Balfour Declaration, a document stating Britain's intentions to support Zionism, the mandate sought to provide a national home for Jews in Palestine, something the Zionist movement had sought for dozens of years previously. The Jewish people had been exiles in foreign lands since the diaspora from the Holy Land in the 1st century BC. After World War II began, the Holocaust led to an increase of Jewish immigration into Palestine due to their plight. The Zionist movement, which claimed the land of Palestine as their own, gained even more support internationally with the horrors of Nazi oppression. The Zionist movement and the Holocaust were the biggest contributors to the influx of Jews into Palestine. Keep in mind that within Palestine itself, prior to the Zionist movement, Palestinians and Jews lived in cities side by side for decades. It was the influx of immigrants, the atrocities against and the displacement of many Palestinians, and the promise of a Jewish national home that led to many pre-conflicts. This piece of Arab literature, from late 1929, is a call to action from the Arab population to go on a national protest against the Balfour Declaration. It references the Western Wall riots just a few months previous, in which 113 Jews were killed mainly by Arab rioters, and 116 Arabs were killed mainly by British security forces. In a British royal report analyzing the conflict, they said, "If there was in Palestine a widespread feeling of resentment at the failure of Britain to grant them some measure of self-government, it is at least probable that this resentment would show itself against the Jews, whose presence in Palestine would be regarded by the Arabs as an obstacle to the fulfillment of their aspirations." However, this conflict goes both ways. This map shows the Zionist movement's claim on the land for the state of Israel, including all the land of Palestine. Many ruled towns at this time were already being taken by Zionist Jews in an attempt to fulfill this goal. In a first-hand account written in The Blood Brothers, Elias Shakur recounts his home village being taken from his community, their families being told to leave immediately, being promised by Israeli soldiers they could come back. Yet later on, when they tried to return, their town was destroyed, exploding in fiery destruction from Israeli tanks. Another example is the Deir Yassin massacre. Eyewitness Jacques de Renier recounts pushing through members of the Irgun, an Israeli terrorist organization, to the village, finding bodies cold. Here the cleaning up had been done with machine guns, then hand grenades. It had been finished off with knives. Anyone could see that. There had been 400 people in this village. About 50 of them escaped and were still alive. Due to the violence and contention, the UN was given the issue a year before the British mandate ended. While conflicts continued, they created the partition plan, in which Palestinians and Jews could once again live in peace. Yet the plan, which split the land half to Palestinians, half to Jews, with Jerusalem under international control, was rejected by the Arab population, which gave the arguments that the plan gave over half the land to minority population, took away the rights of self-determination, and gave Israel the more fertile and rich areas of Palestine. Neighboring Arab nations such as Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and more supported Palestine under similar arguments. Ultimately, the failure of Britain and the United Nations to grant fair self-determination, the driving of Palestinians out of the land, and the terrorist actions some Zionists committed each led to the major turning point. The Nakba. At midnight, May 14th, the Zionist government declared its independence as the State of Israel, the very day the British mandate ended. Fearing the destruction of Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Egypt declared war only hours after, which resulted in what we know as the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. For Palestinians, the Nakba. This was a monumental turning point for both Palestinians and Jews. The result of the war was 750,000 Palestinians displaced, over half their population. 530 villages destroyed, and 78% of historic Palestine now controlled by Israel. To clearly show the land change since the Nakba, we first have the UN partition plan. Alongside is the actual amount of land controlled by Israel before their declaration of independence. Notice the fracturing of Palestine already portrayed in 1948. Next, the map of the aftermath of the 1948 war, showing the growth of Israeli land. And finally, the tiny portion of land Palestinians, by the world's recognition, own today. Yet with current conflicts, these regions, especially in Gaza, have shrunk immeasurably. The immediate political impact for Palestine was the loss of self-determination. Their government was fractured and destroyed from the war. They became an invisible state. They were even taken off world maps and left to the hands of the UN to handle. The social impact of the Nakba revolved around the displacement of over 2/3 of a population. Some 600,000 refugees swamped into the West Bank and Gaza, with 150,000 scattering to neighboring Arab nations and throughout the globe. Palestinian society was centered around the land, especially for those working in agriculture. The Nakba destroyed their entire way of life. Finally, I asked a Palestinian 1967 refugee about the intellectual impact the 1948 war had on her family.
One of the things that people don't really consider is education and how war affects education. My dad lived in the Christian quarter of the Old City during the 1948 war. He was in the 8th grade and he loved school. He was studying 3 languages and was hopeful to become highly educated. However, because of the 1948 war, the schools were closed, and this is not something that we usually think about. But when schools close, education is halted, and sometimes when there's loss of autonomy, then hopes are dashed as well. So my father decided to drop out of school in 8th grade when the schools were closed. He became a tailor. And there's certainly nothing wrong with becoming a tailor, but his story is common for the Palestinians that went through this war, that their education was disrupted and therefore their futures were kind of altered.
The Nakba spread a deep sense of resentment against the Israeli nation, a resentment that remains embedded in much of the Palestinian population. As stated, the Palestinians lived side by side, if not in amity, before the 1948 war. Yet after, back and forth conflict has remained a burning ember throughout history. Any spark sets it ablaze. On the other hand, the Nakba spread throughout the world the dehumanization of the Palestinian people. Palestinians were branded as ignorant, hostile, and violent. They had degenerated to the status of non-persons from their actions against Israel. The dehumanization of the Palestinian people is an ongoing issue, as it leads to the withholding of human rights to their people. To this day, there are over 1.5 million Palestinians still living in overcrowded refugee camps throughout the Middle East, many without access to basic needs. It's been 76 years. The plight of Palestinian refugees remains the longest unresolved refugee crisis in the world. Since the October 7th attack, we've seen history repeat itself. Already, over double the amount of Palestinians have died or been displaced than in the Nakba. Palestinians have been in a repeating cycle of losing land, rights, and lives since the 1948 war. On March 25th, the United Nations passed a resolution calling for a ceasefire during the month of Ramadan. Israel's foreign minister announced afterwards that their country would not abide by the resolution. Ramadan recently ended, and still Palestinians die daily from Israeli bombing.
Excellencies, the humanitarian system in Gaza is collapsing. I'm extremely concerned by the inhumane conditions faced by Gaza's 2.2 million people as they struggle to survive without any of the basics. Everyone in Gaza is hungry, while 500,000 grapple with catastrophic levels of food insecurity. The death, destruction, displacement, hunger, loss, and grief in Gaza over the past 120 days are a scar on our shared humanity and conscience.
Today, Palestinians define their lives intellectually, socially, and culturally around the loss of human rights, around their sufferings, and around the catastrophes they have lived through. Understanding the turning point, the 1948 war, and subsequent expulsion of the Palestinian people is essential to understanding the conflict today. While we cannot justify the acts of extremists on either side of the conflict, we can begin to understand that the complexities of today's conflict is a direct consequence of the 1948 Nakba.